Welcome back, everyone. Today is day 5 of World FTD Awareness Week. All week, I'm sharing great interviews on different aspects of FTD and sharing actions you can take to help advance a future free of FTD. The theme for today is focused on advocacy, focused on different ways you can get your perspective out to the world to make change to benefit families facing FTD. And I'm so thrilled to be talking to Linde Lee. She is a wife, a mother of 2 girls, a registered nurse, and a fierce advocate in FTD. Her family has a history with FTD, something which deeply informs her perspective and passion as an advocate on behalf of her and her sisters and the next generation. Linde, welcome. I am so happy to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Well, you are a definite fierce advocate in this FTD community, which I'm so grateful for, that you are using your voice really for the greater good. So you speak so openly and honestly on this subject, which is the only reason why I'm asking you. But will you tell us about your family's history with FTD and how it informs your perspective today and your passion for FTD advocacy?
So FTD is something that initially started in my family in the late 1980s to 1990s. It started in my grandmother. So my maternal grandmother, her name is Beverly, my mother's mom, and she started having symptoms kind of in her mid to late 50s, in which she just started having these personality changes, kind of quirks to her behavior. Um, just something changed within her, and her whole personhood kind of took a turn. Um, she was going through people's dumpsters. She was dumpster diving, searching through trash. She was hoarding items and making really outlandish comments. Her diet had changed significantly. So at this time, when these changes started happening, I was a very young child. At the age between like 2 and 5 is kind of when the most notable symptoms started with her. And so I didn't really get to know my grandma prior to dementia or FTD. And in the 90s, they didn't really coin the disease as FTD. They called it fixed disease. So it was something that wasn't confirmed until someone had passed. And so with this diagnosis of fixed disease, we at least had some baseline information, kind of what to expect, why her behaviors were the way they were. Wow. And we could just move on and help her in the capacity of the duration of the disease. Back then, there was nothing given. I don't believe they even prescribed anything. Maybe a few things for behavioral management, but beyond that, it was just kind of, this is your diagnosis, and there's not really much we can do. And this is kind of the timeline of what you're looking at. So my grandmother passed in 2006. And my mom, during that whole time of her diagnosis, was my mom, or she was my grandmother's advocate. So she was her power of attorney. She made sure that my grandma had all the necessary medical supplies or hygiene supplies. She would scout out different nursing homes to make sure that she was in the best facility for her needs and that the caregivers understood how to care for my grandmother, because she wasn't your typical, shall we say, run-of-the-mill client in a skilled nursing facility. She was one of the youngest patients, and her symptoms looked different than, their other dementia or Alzheimer's patients. And so I grew up watching my mom be a caregiver, and it was something that was family affair. If my mom had to bring supplies out to my grandmother, it was all of us went together, and it was a time that we went to the nursing home, and it was because she was my grandma. It was family. It was something family did, is kind of what was instilled in me. But also, my mom always used to say, like you're bringing smiles to other clients there too. There's other people there that don't have family that visit or friends that visit. And so you're helping them as well as this is your grandma and it's our job to take care of her. And so that was something that was just very ingrained in me and my sisters from a very young age. And so in 2006, my grandmother had passed, and my mom then started having symptoms of FTD in what now in hindsight is about 2010. Um, Started off as some just like language changes. She would drop her words. She would forget the meaning of words, or she would replace words with an incorrect word or use it in the incorrect text. And then she was having pretty significant sleeping issues or sleeping changes. So things that were talked about as just postmenopausal. We had was going through a divorce or had just gone through a divorce. And so, depression, stress, middle age crisis, they can chalk it up to so many different things because those initial symptoms were so subtle.
Mhm.
Um, and then 2 to 3 years down the line, so 2012, 2013, is when it became more apparent that there was something wrong. It started with, boundaries were kind of the biggest, boundaries are kind of the easiest thing to discuss because it was personal boundaries. So your personal space was no longer something that was in awareness to her. She would touch people that she wouldn't necessarily go up to someone in public and touch, but she would just say things or do things that just don't fit social norms that just make you different. And at that time, I was 24 years old. So I'm a young female. I had just graduated college. I'm starting my nursing career. And, you know, I can sense that there's something wrong. I know the questions to ask. I know the laws of HIPAA, and yet I couldn't get any medical professionals to help me and to help navigate getting her seen. Because at that point, she had developed something called anosognosia that she had no awareness to the symptoms that she had. So she, prior to FTD, was concerned about preventing dementia. She was doing all these brain healthy activities, reducing stress, trying to exercise more, taking, healthy amounts of omega-3s, making sure that fish was a part of her diet. She was following the Mediterranean diet. She was doing these preventative measures because she was fearful that it would happen to her. But then as it happened to her, her recollection or recognition of the disease or the symptoms was no longer there. And so she just kind of started spiraling. It just kept going. We couldn't get doctors to diagnose her. She was so resistant to going in and getting help. We had neighbors and family members and friends of hers for over 25 years sending us emails, Facebook messages, text messages saying there's something wrong with your mom. You know, we suspect it could be, some sort of dementia or maybe she's depressed. We're not sure, but we've asked her not to come around anymore. And so these pivotal pinnacle people that were supposed to support you walked out. And slowly, my mom became very isolated. People that had been within her inner circle for years were no longer there. And it was just myself and my sisters.
Can
And
I,
she,
not to cut you off, can I just ask a
yeah,
question? As you
yeah.
started seeing um, these symptoms sort of appear, I don't know if you were thinking they were symptoms at the time, were you ever did you ever sort of think maybe this is something that this is Pick's disease, or did you take that to the doctor to be like, this, my grandmother had this, I think maybe this might be something that my mom did that ever sort of come up during that time?
It did. It's one of those things because those behaviors, I think because her symptoms were just so subtle and because they're she could function so well in some capacities of her life. And she could put on a face for people and kind of mute some of those behaviors or those the in like the areas that she was lacking. She could be able to fill it in with something else. But she was able to almost create this fake identity in front of certain people. She could put on a face for certain crowds. And so when I had called her primary care, I said, I know that with HIPAA, you can't take everything I say verbatim and that you don't have to do anything with what I say, but we have this family history. And I'm concerned that these are the beginning stages. And it was just one of those things where they just kind of jot everything down. They say, thank you for calling. We'll mention it to her primary care nurse and her primary care doctor. And then there was just no follow up. And because of that, too, she was an independent woman. It's not like we were going with to doctor's appointments. She was in her early 50s. She was 52 years old. So we weren't invited to go with to the doctors where we would be able to voice these concerns. And she became so paranoid that we were mentioning it or that others were mentioning that there was something wrong, that she started to retreat back within herself and she wasn't sharing information with us anymore. And so it became this just very odd conundrum of what do we do? He doesn't see anything wrong with it. Nobody else is validating these concerns, but yet we still have people telling us that there's an issue. And, you know, we didn't know how to navigate it. We tried our best to find avenues, but when you're, starting your career, you're starting, at this point between 2013 and 2015, got my first hospital nursing job. I was, dating and got engaged, got married. 2015, I had my first baby. So much life is happening around you as a young adult that caring for an ailing parent that's that young and still so capable is very challenging. And honestly, there were times that I questioned if we were making things up, like that we were trying to blame this new mom that was being, that had been created as a disease process versus maybe just this is her reaction to stress. Maybe she is just, having more depression than we initially thought. Perhaps it is menopause that's causing her to be a little different. Like you just don't know because the doctors aren't saying there's something wrong. You tend to trust their opinion.
100%.
So
Yeah. If doctors aren't flagging it, putting it on your radar, it's incredible to me when doctors don't flag this. But, I guess when someone's coming in and they're seeing them for only 15, 20 minutes or whatever for that checkup, they're not there 24/7 seeing what that behavior is. So I'm sure they dust it off. I know they dust it off. So,
yeah. And I think she had, and I know others, like they have this third sense that there's something wrong and they are trying their hardest to hide it because they don't want to admit that there's something wrong in those first stages of awareness, and then as the disease progresses, then there's just this utter unawareness of, that they won't ever gain that awareness back because she had done tons of research. I mean, she had books on books on books on preventing dementia and being brain healthy and brain conscious. And she was trying her hardest to keep herself afloat and staying engaged. And, it hit a certain point where she couldn't play it off anymore. She couldn't fool anyone anymore. So it we sought out, 3 different neurologists to try and get a diagnosis. I mean, she even wasn't diagnosed by a neurologist. We got it in 2015. We kind of gave her an ultimatum. I was pregnant with my first daughter, and my sister had 2 kids, and she loved babysitting. I mean, her grandkids were her life. And we just said to her, Mom, we think there's something wrong. Prove to us that there's nothing wrong. Go see a doctor. go get an MRI, just do the workup for dementia because your mom had it and prove us wrong, you know. And we thought this is, we're finally going to get someone that's going to give us a diagnosis. So during that appointment, she went by herself for her MRI. She went by herself for her neurocognitive testing. They didn't ask family opinion for any of that. So here you have this patient seeking a workup for dementia, and you're not going to ask the family members, hey, what's going on? What else aren't we seeing? That extra narrative that's happening behind the scenes. And we were invited in then for the revealing meeting, kind of where we discussed all of her diagnostic testing and kind of where we were at. And at that time, which this is 5 years into symptoms, we were told that her MRI was normal, that it just had some age-related brain changes for a postmenopausal woman, and that her neurocognitive testing did not show anything that would indicate FTD.
Wow.
She gave us a diagnosis of OCD, which was new, and then adjustment mood disorder, which is similar to just situational depression, that she was just very hyperfixated on certain aspects of her life that were causing her to be depressed. And that was it. It was kind of, you can follow up with us again if you'd like, but there's nothing more that we can do for you here.
What year was
This was in 2015.
that? Was in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
And then what do you do with that information, especially once you see scans? Was it a PET scan and all the things?
At that time, it was just an MRI. They didn't do a PET scan, and they didn't necessarily show us the images either. I mean, because we were not on my mom's health, we weren't her advanced healthcare directors. So my mom told them, I only want certain pieces of information shared with my daughters, because she was so paranoid that we would have too much information, that we would do something wrong with that information, or that we would twist it against her. I don't know where her level of paranoia was, but we weren't allowed in. And so then we couldn't help. So basically, between 2015 and 2018, her symptoms just progressed further. She was no longer able to hold a stable job. She had spent all of her retirement, so $150,000 within 3 years. She had been victim of financial exploitation, money scams, and then we found out later she was sexually exploited as well. So she had people, predators, reaching out to her via email or Facebook, and she was responding. In November of 2018, we had noticed that, mom wasn't just showing up at our houses, that she wasn't hyper texting us, multiple times a day. And I was at work and I just we're talking with my sisters, just what is happening? Where is mom? Has anybody heard from her? Has anybody seen her, talked to her? We're trying to figure out what happened. And I knew that you can look up active inmates on the county jail website. So I just looked up our local county jail, and my mom's name as an active inmate. And not that she had been an inmate just that day, but that she had been there for 2 weeks by the time that we recognized that she was not at home. And I mean, the feeling of seeing that, like someone that's never had a criminal record, that's been this upstanding citizen, given back to her community. She was had her master's degree. She was a physical therapist, like all these things that she held so proudly. To see it in that light was so, I mean, it was so hurtful for me that I couldn't protect her, that it had to get to that point, because no one should have to get to that point to just get help. And also navigating the jails is almost impossible. If you don't have experience, I didn't know where she was. I didn't know how to get a hold of her, who to contact. Nobody had called us to let her know that she had been arrested and was in jail. And the next day, I received a letter from her from jail. um, explaining why she was there and kind of, what she was worried about, and basically her just refuting kind of all the wrongs that had happened to her. And she wasn't necessarily concerned about getting out. She just asked me, she's like, can you just go over to my house and make sure that I took the trash out? And can you get my mail so that nobody steals my mail? But she never, asked for help, and she never asked me to get her out. Uh, And on that same day, we received a letter from her cellmate who had been living with her for the last 2 weeks. And in it, she just mentioned, here's your mom's caseworker, here's her phone number, please call her. The letter says she shouldn't be in here with these animals. I'm fairly certain she has something like dementia. Maybe she has medications she should be on. And, here's the information that I can give you. And I'm so sorry, but I'm keeping her safe. I'm letting her use my hygiene products. I'm going to try and get her to shower. This complete stranger just gave us this, massive favor and gift to know that I at least knew she was safe. Um, and luckily the next day I was able to get her. I was able to get a hold of her caseworker, and explain kind of what we were seeing, what we were dealing with, and that this was, a turning point for us, and that we were able that in that time to get her into another neurologist in December. So they released her on the conditions that we, follow up with a neurologist. And so in December of 2018, it was 1 week before Christmas, she finally got a definitive diagnosis of behavioral variant FTD. So it took
How long
8
that took?
years.
8 years. So, Lindy, like from those first scans, I mean, were you guys ever able to see those original scans to be able to have this neurologist compare the two?
So from the 2015 scans, I have never seen, and I've not been able to even gain access to them even now,
Mhm.
even after going through legal battles to get, guardianship um, over, her as an individual. But oddly enough, in January or in March of 2018, she had gone to the neurologist again, unbeknownst to us, and had an MRI, and she somehow coerced one of their nurses, like an LPN, to write a letter saying that the MRI was normal. So 5 months before diagnosis, she was able to convince somebody that her MRI was normal or to write it in a letter. When looking back in December then of 2018, the neurologist was astonished. She's like, it is grossly abnormal. You know, it is completely impacted by this disease. There are severe areas of atrophy in the frontal and temporal cortexes that very much indicate FTD. And not only have we bypassed mild stage of disease, we are in the moderate to late stages.
Mm.
So, like, this is an advanced dementia. This isn't even just the beginning. Even when you're seeing someone, she was somehow able to manipulate people within the medical field to kind of give her what she needed to get her clearance for, to say that she doesn't have the disease. I don't know why she thought that hard to not have that label, but she just didn't want it. She wasn't going to be labeled by it. And in December, when she got her diagnosis, her sister had already been diagnosed with FTD, and her brother was showing symptoms. So this wasn't, we already knew it was happening in amongst other family members. So it wasn't just my grandmother and her. And so that was when we became aware that this is very obviously genetic disease. Is this something that is inherited? And it's coming from my grandmother's side. And so in 2019, we were then given the option to get genetic testing done with my mom. My mom was able to have genetic testing done. And at that time,
So she was able to opt in to do genetic testing.
yes, yes. And it was they did like a very broad spectrum panel of tests on her. So it involved saliva, I believe it was a skin biopsy, as well as blood. And so initially we were concerned about her cooperating with it. Um, but they were doing it because it could have been, they wanted to make sure that it wasn't just FTD, that it could have been, was it Lewy body disease? Was it Hicks disease? Could it have been some different variation that causes FTD-like symptoms? And so we got the synopsis then in December of 2019. So a full year after her official diagnosis. And because of insurance, because it was run underneath her, it had to be done then in the realm of she had to be in the room. So they gave us her genetic results, and she was found to be a um, positive carrier for MAPT, which is one of the three main types of genetic FTD. And with that diagnosis, it's autosomal dominant, meaning that anybody that comes from, her first generation offspring have a 50% chance of inheritance, meaning myself and my sisters had 50% chance of having the mutation as well.
And like I said at the beginning of this interview, is that you talk so openly and so honestly about this journey, how it's affected your grandmother, your mother, your aunts, your uncles, and, potentially you and your sisters.
Mhm.
I had originally heard your story on the Remember Me podcast. It was in two parts, and I remember listening to it and was just so moved. I mean, everyone's hearing your story, and I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. So why do you tell your story? Why are you out there telling me? Why are you telling your story?
Yeah. So during, when my mom was alive, um, I didn't have the ability to tell anybody.
Mhm.
She was still so prevalent on social media platforms. And it was a way to preserve her dignity and her autonomy as an adult. And so, for privacy purposes, it was important to not disclose that information because it didn't feel right, because she was still there and she still had so much to give, but that I didn't want who she was now to only be what FTD did in the process of getting there. And so when she passed in 2021, I mean, it was one of those things where she wasn't physically there to caregive anymore. And I always just felt so wronged and terrible by how her story played out, because she had this beautiful life before FTD that the ending of her life, somehow overshadowed that. And I didn't want that to continue to be the script I played in my head. And so I took that experience as something that if my family is going through this, surely other families must be experiencing some degree of what we went through. And if by using my mom's story or the examples of the areas in which we failed, or where we could have done something different, or areas where we, those little moments of success, if I can use that to help ease the journey for someone else, I will do that in a heartbeat. You can't go through some of these massive experiences to harbor the information for yourself. It should be used for the greater good. And that's 100% what she would do if it was her. She would want to use her story to help others and ease the process. And in doing so, I've been able to retell her story differently. I've been able to reflect on moments where, it wasn't all terrible. And I wasn't always the best caregiver. Humans have limitations. You have frustrations. Your patience level runs thin. And there were moments that I am still working through where I was not my best self to her. And maybe it is, maybe I am working out of, regret and sorrow and grief or trauma here, but I'm able to repaint how she is in my mind, and I'm able to create a story of beauty versus from something that was so ugly. And I just think if people had more of an awareness of what the disease is, what it looks like, what these symptoms, from the naked eye look like, maybe we can create a more empathetic world for those that are still living with the disease. I still have an aunt and two uncles that are navigating the world with FTD. And the thought of anything comparable happening to them is, it's still something I'm trying to prevent. And, with the genetic risk in 2021, so 1 month after my mom had passed, I underwent genetic testing myself. And at that time, I was then diagnosed as a positive genetic carrier as well. And in my family, it has 100% penetrance. There isn't anybody that is able to have the genetic mutation and not manifest disease. And it follows a very familial suit. And I'm, in my mid 30s, and my mom started symptoms when she was 50. And so there is this element of a timeline that if I'm not using this period of time, I say I'm kind of in this dot, dot, dot period of time where, at first it was my mom and caregiving, and my sole focus was on her. And now, I have this future that I have to try and prevent. So I have to do all these things to try and think of ways that I can have a different future. And so I'm in this dot, dot, dot phase where I have the time and the headspace to use my voice, to use, my story, my mom's story, my grandma's story, to be able to use it in a way that promotes change and to use it effectively versus, being angry about it. And it's healing for me. It's a way that I can heal some of those wounds. I can retell her story and I can find her again. There was so much of my mom that I forgot who she was. I there's parts of her I still don't remember, and that still catch me off guard. That I can't just reflect on, tell me about your mom before FTD. It's hard to do that.
There's like a
But
gray area, right? Like,
yeah, yeah.
where does the disease start? Like, where did it
Hmm.
start? You just can't pinpoint, so it's very gray. There's,
Right.
yeah, so I
And,
understand that.
and you're just trying to like find that person again, to find your mom. I didn't have a strained relationship with her. We fought like a mom and daughter do, but there wasn't hate then. There was so much love. But so much of this disease takes that love is going into fighting for them, but it's not necessarily into the physical love between the two people. And that's, maybe that is my guilt living out in purpose. And that's fine if that's the way it is, because it brings my mom to me. It's an honor to tell her story and to impact other people if it can. If it can help one other person to have a easier journey, then it will have been 100% for the greater good.
I mean, your story is for the greater good. The story that you share of your mother, your journey is really for the greater good. And I want you to know that because it's so brave. And it's these stories, your story, that will get people listening and move the needle. And I think that is our goal, right? Is to be able to raise awareness. Okay, Linde, where do you see sort of your roadblocks right now when it comes to the genetic form of FTD? Like where do you see your roadblocks?
I think the biggest roadblock I see is not so much in like what the future holds. I truly think that the biggest roadblock is just the lack of awareness of the disease. I I don't think there is enough understanding because there's not examples to see. Like when you describe the symptoms of someone lacking empathy or someone having changes in behavior, there isn't like concrete examples that people can see that and understand it. And nor is it known. It's just not a well-known disease. And unless you happen to be one of the lucky few that is affected by it, you know? And I think that is the biggest hurdle that we have to overcome is just this general understanding of what the disease entails, what it looks like for those that are affected. We all have, you get a diagnosis of cancer. People know what cancer treatment looks, right? You get a diagnosis even of Alzheimer's disease. People kind of know what it looks like. They can see examples of it. There isn't a good way to learn what FTD is unless you have just general knowledge out for the public. And I think too, it's with that then in understanding the disease more, it offers different conduits then for caregivers to find ways that people can help with the caregiving journey, whether it's, respite care for the caregiver or it's, assisting with the loved one. And a lot of people struggle to find connection with someone that has FTD as they progress in their disease state. Some of the behaviors are very challenging, it's hard to be around.
Mhm.
And yet it's because they're just afraid. And so having that knowledge that they can do other activities, that yes, your friendship or your relationship isn't going to look the same as it did before, but that they still value that social connection, that there's still ways to connect with them, and that they're not always bogged by FTD, that they have moments that they are genuinely themselves. There's moments of connection, when my mom would hug me, it was my mom hugging me. It wasn't FTD. Like that was my mom. That element of her was still there. Like some of the things before that maybe was FTD, but that they're still there and they want that connection. They need it. They thrive off of it. And you can see how a person just continues to their life is somewhat stable. Their disease progression isn't fast progressing when you're not changing these outside factors. And so I do think so much of it just starts from that level of just community awareness, community understanding, so then also caregivers going out with their loved one in public, that they're not as fearful of their behaviors eliciting a negative response to someone else or to have it reflect back on it. The world is more empathetic to those who see different,
Mhm.
and that there's this level of understanding that not everyone is neurologically all the same, that it's not as isolating. I think the caregiver just they give everything to they self isolate themselves so much to provide safety and the autonomy and dignity of their loved one because all of that is leaving and person they're becoming is so much different than the person they were, that they're trying to preserve that image for others. It's selfless, right? Like we just sacrifice everything for our loved one. And it shouldn't have to be that because it should just be that that person is who they are now, but we can reflect back and that they should be treated the same way in society as they were before.
Mhm.
Maybe with just in a different way to connect though. And I saw that with my mom's friends was that they lacked that connection, but then there were other people that could come in, such as my mother-in-law, and she could connect with my mom on many different ways, thinking of tons of different activities. So there are people out there that can help create those ideas. But until we have an awareness of what the disease is, those ideas can't listen, like they can't proliferate. Um, and I think having that understanding of the disease and that general awareness will also then help with earlier diagnosis because people will start recognizing the signs and symptoms. They might, a loved one, a partner might just say, hey, there's something going on, there's something off. Perhaps physicians will start listening to families more if there's a greater awareness that this disease exists. It's this cascade effect of you educate on the simple facts and the potential that it could have really does integrate in so many different parts of the journey moving forward. I think too, you get earlier diagnosis. Most of the research trials, so any of the therapeutics that are in the research stages, you have to be um, in the mild symptom onset. By the time most people get diagnoses, they're in the moderate stages. So they can't even qualify for those clinical trials. And so those clinical trials are struggling to get participants because there physically aren't any to participate because they're not catching that diagnosis early enough. And then you just think of if you have that wherewithal, okay, then more people are going to seek out genetic testing. They might have that understanding like, oh, so yeah, my grandpa had something weird like that. And then my dad died early, but maybe it was early onset Alzheimer's. Well, if you have that wherewithal or that understanding, you might think differently about kind of where you're at in your life. I think, honestly, just baseline education of just what the disease is really would really just help the community at large and those around them. And it would help fuel so much of these things that we need to move forward to help eradicate the disease or to find ways to treat symptoms.
Yeah. Dr. Bruce Miller, I was talking to him the other day, and what he had said that he had learned was that when people are in their, 40s, 50s, 60s, and you start seeing, maybe depression or, maybe a midlife crisis, when usually at this time, this is when people are sort of, finding their footing and everything should be pretty stable for the most part. That when you start seeing changes in someone's behavior, that is a change in the brain, which, are sometimes first symptoms, sometimes first signs. So, it's like, listen, I didn't know about FTD until I had to know about FTD, and I think that's the issue is that, and this is the beauty of being able to talk. And for me, my whole purpose of raising awareness is for exactly that, right? To be able to talk openly about what FTD is, how it presents, what it looks like, so that we can get in there early and that we can educate doctors that really brush it off, that really aren't flagging anything, so that's why I talk about it. I know that's, why you are, fiercely sharing your story. So, what gives you hope about the current state of FTD research?
So, 5 years ago, when my mom was diagnosed, there was nothing clinically on the horizon, no clinical trials. I mean, they were doing a few different things for symptom management, but really not a whole lot. In the last 5 years, we have made massive strides in just the neurodegenerative community. And I think that is how I try and view the future moving forward is just the attention that is being given towards finding cures for neurodegeneration and diseases caused by that. Look at lecanemab with Alzheimer's. We have one Alzheimer's approved FDA drug, and we have another one about to get approved. Like that's massive. That wasn't even a discussion before. There is tofersen that got approved by the FDA for ALS. So there's these therapies that are on the horizon. And if they find a therapy that works with one of the neurodegenerative diseases, there's a very good potential that it has the ability to cross translate or that they can use that technology to apply it to something like FTD by changing certain molecules or targeting a different area of the brain. But those advances truly are helping the neurodegenerative community as a whole. And I think 5 years ago, I had less hope. Had I done my genetic testing then, I think I'd be in a much different place, like in a much darker place, because there wasn't anything. Um, but now there are a lot of things on the horizon. There's been some massive movement that even just in the last year, there's the awareness that's occurred in the last year is insurmountable. The drug discoveries that have occurred, you know, is huge. There's two, in 6 months even. So there's been a lot of momentum behind it. There are people that are starting to listen and they're seeing the value in treating these diseases. And it's becoming where it's not such a rare neurodegenerative disease because it's not rare. The rareness comes from the lack of understanding and from the lack of discussion. But it is not rare when it is the most common form of early onset dementia for people under the age of 65. So if something is so rare, then why is it the most common? Even, 2019, they did a 60 minutes interview after the Super Bowl on FTD. To take that spotlight right after the Super Bowl for the prevalence of this disease and to take up that space, that is so impactful, that is that platform. And I think it takes things like that to gain awareness. But it's hard to find a platform to have such a big impact. And I think I just am finding whatever platform I can to take a chance, see if it sticks, and get into conversations. And I think that's the other thing too, is I educate myself on what's happening in the medical community. I have that basic underlying understanding coming as a registered nurse. Not that I understand everything or a lot of it. It's very minimal amounts that I'm able to understand, but I am asking questions and I'm sending emails and I'm reading abstracts, trying to understand. And then I reach out to the investigator. And I think the biggest hope I also have is the people of our community, those working behind the scenes that aren't necessarily the front runners that you would know, the scientists. It's the most incredible group of people I've met. They're dedicating their life's work to this. If my sole purpose of telling my mom's story is gaining awareness, like they're dedicating their entire profession to changing my story. I mean, that's so selfless. These people just have this level of compassion because they see what the disease does and they want to stop it as well. They see that the problem and they want to find options for people. They feel the hopelessness and they're trying to provide that hope. And, the more I have conversations with the researchers or medical professionals or other neurologists, I mean, it just fuels my passion to have more. I don't get discouraged. There's times I get discouraged, but the more I can talk to someone, it's a cascade effect. And then I just want to keep learning. Um, and so I don't think it's not a hopeless future, not that doesn't, I don't want to downplay that the future looks hopeful, but right now, those that are in the thick of it, like their hope looks different, right? And I I think of it from both perspectives is the hope for the future, but how can we provide hope for right now? How do we do things for those that are in the midst of it? I'm fighting for my future, but I need to fight for those that are fighting currently. It's a family disease. It's one of those things where it doesn't matter if you're genetically the same as the other family members. When you're in the FTD community, you become this close-knit family and you all fight for each other. And I think that's super important, just to have that mindset that I'm fighting for myself, but I'm fighting for my community and my other family.
Truly. What actions do you wish people just learning about FTD take?
I think the biggest thing is, ask questions, educate yourself. Learning is so important to understanding the disease. If you spend, 5 minutes reading about what the frontal cortex or the frontal lobe of the brain does, the fact that it's in charge of your personality, your ability to make decisions, impulse control, um, executive functioning, inhibition. If you just understand how that lobe of the brain works in its normal functioning capacity, so much of the symptoms make sense
Mhm.
when you're that part of the brain is not functioning correctly or it's shrinking and dying in the process. And if you can make sense of the symptoms, you can then care for the person differently. And so I think like educating yourself and to the best of why are they acting this way? How can I be treating them differently? Why does my loved one not want to shower specifically? I feel like that one was such a pivotal thing in just understanding neurodegeneration is, showering and hygiene was so challenging with my mom. And I didn't understand it until someone said, well, just think of it in the sense that the way that that water feels on them is a painful response. And so they might be experiencing pain in the shower. And so they're avoiding it because it's a negative experience versus the thing that used to be positive. And so they're not forming their hygiene habits because they want to bug you or that they're doing it to be disobedient or just because they don't care. It's that the experience is no longer pleasant to them and they're avoiding it. And simple things like that make total sense. Like, okay, so then how can we adjust this? Can we just do bed baths? Can we shampoo in a different capacity without having to go into a shower? Perhaps baths are better, when they're capable. Um, so I truly think it's like asking questions, asking caregivers in what capacity you can help if you're not someone that's affected by it, but that you're trying to support someone in the journey, is asking caregivers, what do you need? How can I be involved? How can I help in their care? How can I connect with them right now? Like, what are they into? Maintaining that interest and not just walking away because it's hard or because it's different. Um, because the person is still there. They still relish in those social interactions or those moments of normalcy. And the caregiver needs to see that they're being treated with that same dignity that they're trying so hard to maintain. I mean, they do. They need to see that others are still view them as a human being with needs and wants and value and not just the disease. Um, it just it again, it comes down to that level of understanding and developing a sense of empathy and stepping in where you feel like you could have success. And not everybody can be on, you know, in my family, I struggled more being one-on-one with my mom. And so I did a lot more with her paperwork. I was her medical personnel. I did all the legal meetings, court battles, anything on that nature. I did all the paperwork on the backside because my sister was so much more tolerable in the moments that were hard, where I would have a threshold and her threshold was bigger than mine. And so she had the patience. And so it's not always necessarily being with the person, it's doing other things, helping in other capacities, and but being present and not walking away and staying, for the person that's affected and for the person that's caring for them.
What would you recommend to a family just learning about FTD in their own lives?
I think the biggest thing is that you have to just give yourself so much grace in the process. You're losing someone. The whole aspect of, the anticipatory grief, of losing the person in front of you. You know, you're going through the 5 stages of grief while the person is living. And those stages fluctuate. There's days of anger, there's days of denial, there's days of acceptance. You're going to go through those motions. And you might go through those motions for 10 to 20 years. You might go through them for less frequently. Like there isn't that guarantee of time, but you have to give yourself the ability to feel those things and to give yourself grace in the moments where you need it, because there is no easy way to navigate a disease. There's no easy way to lose someone in front of you. And you are losing them slowly over a number of years. And then eventually you lose them indefinitely in a whole new set of grief arose. And so I think the biggest thing is like a caregiver is just giving yourself those moments where you can't always be strong. You can't always have the right answer. Like you're going to trip, you're going to fall. There's going to be times that you have failure after failure, but you need to relish the success and take it and just run and allow that to sustain you for whatever period of time you need it till you have another success. Because there's no easy way to do it. There's no right way to navigate this disease. And it's just, there's not a lot of aspects that are simple or easy to deal with. You just have to take the moments as they come, live in the moment, you know, reflect on the past to remember who that person was before the disease to help gear how you care for them in that moment. You know, and I think I think of all of that and just thinking of how to navigate too, your ideal of the future, right? There's so much of your life that when you get a diagnosis of something that is terminal and that is neurodegenerative, you begin a grieving process too of your future, of this future that you had envisioned. That's changing and it's not going to be the same. And trying to not, you know, we always plan for the future, right? Like you start retirement at a young age to plan for your future. And so changing that idea that your future isn't guaranteed. And so living in the moment, living for, you know, those moments that you have that clarity where that FTD fog lifts and you get to have that genuine connection, and creating a support system around you to feel less isolated. You know, there's no easy way, and I don't know that there's a right way or there's something specific. I just think you got to just do the best job that you can do with the resources that you have and survive. Unfortunately, is how it was with me. And I think by telling my stories that it shouldn't be just survival, it should be a thriving. Like we should be able to move from surviving to thriving, and just regardless if it's thriving with FTD, but to be able to thrive in the moments that you can.
Thank you, Linde. Okay, with that, I'm going to get into the calls of action for today that we can be taking. Okay, so number one, if you're based in the US, take part in today's AFTD advocacy action. This link will be at the bottom of this video. By advocating together as a community, we can make a difference. And number two, for all living outside the US, tell a health professional, a friend, a neighbor, or your social media networks about why you care about FTD. If you go to the AFTD's website via the link below, you'll find messaging and graphics you can download and share for today and each day of the campaign. Number three, tell others why you're passionate about FTD advocacy on social media. If you go to the AFTD.org, you'll find messaging and graphics you can download and share. And if you haven't already, we encourage you to change your profile picture on social media. Just visit the campaign page at the bottom of this video, follow the instructions, and show the world you care about FTD. Linde, we don't deserve you, honestly. Thank you so much for sharing your story. You get me every time, but your passion, your sense of community, everything that you are doing will make a difference. So I speak for myself and I speak for our community when I say, thank you so much. Thank you for being brave. Thank you for telling your mom's story, your family's story, your story. It is so important.
Thank you. Thank you for, giving me the space to continue to do that, and, allowing that my story has impact. Thank you for finding value in that. I think that's validation enough to keep a person going.
Thank you.